Okay, folks, well, try to make up for last week. I'll start on time this week. Thank you so much for those that stuck it out and listened to what I think was maybe 15 minutes of a class there. But thanks for coming, everybody, to this is the second semester or fifth year of these free lectures. It's exciting to be here and to see all the things coming on in the future. And just to give you in the class and maybe some of the viewers an idea, we're hoping to have lined up in September a lecture series with the same program at UBC. And so for next semester, next September, we will likely have a room booked for our lectures on Wednesday, and then another room booked for Friday, where we're all, and I guess I'll be in Vancouver sometimes, but you know, you and me sometimes will be sitting in a room watching the live stream from Vancouver. In fact, I haven't made a big deal of it. I got to arrange it, but hopefully even next Friday, the UBC convention, we can find a room here on campus, and we'll be broad streaming the class here. So it's great having people watching live online, and we're going to be, I guess, watching from Quebec, other campuses springing. I think Prohibition started last century, right? Reefer Madness and the kind of conspiracy to eliminate hemp that I'll talk about in the second half here. But Prohibition goes back much further, and as such, it's much more obscure in its origins. But in other ways, some of the original prohibitions are quite well documented, and they're based in religion. And there's, I guess, some mythologies of prohibition as well that sort of help us maybe gain an understanding of why these prohibitions were enacted and how they were justified. And so I'm going to kind of go towards the mythology before sort of the reality. And the mythology is right in the book of Genesis in the Bible. And the first prohibition that we know of, and the time and dates may be obscure, right? Because exactly when Adam and Eve were around, could have been, a couple thousand years ago. Maybe it was 400,000 years ago. I don't know. But anyway, it's mythology, right? Adam and Eve. What was the first thing they were told to do? Well, you're not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, always seems funny to me people would worship a god that would stop them from gaining knowledge of what is good and evil, right? You'd figure the first thing that you'd want to teach people would be some morals, right? But he's like, yeah, no, I don't want you to know the difference between good and evil, or knowledge in general. That's not you. Just go live in the bush, right? But us, we're not happy with that, right? You tell us, oh, don't go there. What's the first thing we're gonna do? Like as a kid, it's like, oh, don't go in that cupboard. Well, okay. You wait for your chance to get in the cupboard. It's sort of this natural instinct where we want to test the line and see why. And so, God, for whatever reason, is like, oh, don't touch the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Well, it's blamed upon women for having bitten this apple, so-called apple. Well, why were women blamed? That's sort of interesting, right? This is a myth, right? This isn't likely based upon fact. And it's curious as to why this mythology, right, that's sort of created to back up some very real circumstances, right? And so why were women blamed, right? Like what purpose did that serve, and how is that justified? Well, maybe it wasn't a woman. Maybe it was Mother Earth that was blamed, and sort of in general the worship of female deities and of femininity and of this sort of goddesses that were at the time very much competition for God, right? Because let's be honest, it was God that came down with this prohibition, and the God of the sort of the Hebrews and the Jews wasn't the first male god at the time, right? We can go back and study all sorts of other cultures and times. So there's male deities existing for a long time, but they were almost secondary to the goddess, the mother goddess. If you look back in ancient times, most of the earliest symbols and artifacts are of female goddesses, like big, pregnant, fat ones, and just like big, breasts and very animated. But it was goddess worshipping. I'm very certain that dominated religion for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe since the beginning of it. But anyway, this group comes along and God comes up with this prohibition: don't eat the apple. Well, was it an apple? Well, obviously not, right? Like, apples don't inspire the knowledge of good and evil, right? Well, what does, right? Well, some might believe it was cannabis, marijuana. One of my very best friends, I didn't bring his first book, which is Green Gold, The Tree of Life, Marijuana and Magic and Religion. Chris Bennett has just, his last book, Cannabis, The Soma Solution, I don't think gets into prohibition as much as, say, sex, drugs, violence in the Bible. But Chris has been studying this for a very long time. He's just over in Vancouver. He's coming to our convention here in February 20th. He's the opening speaker, and he's the opening speaker at UBC next week as well. Anyway, Chris has studied this extensively, and a lot of what I'm speaking about is certainly from him, but I grew up within the church, and I know some of its doctrines and have studied it myself. So, but I do give a tremendous amount of credit for Chris for helping open me up. But anyway, so apple, right? Well, Chris believes the apple was the cannabis plant. He also believes the tree of life was the cannabis plant. Well, I'm not going to argue with him there. That's very well documented. You can go to the Babylonians, the Assyrians, the Zoroastrians, as Chris, lays out in the Cannabis, the Soma Solution, the Hindus, the Buddhists, just about every ancient culture in the world would have referred to the cannabis plant as the tree of life. Because as I mentioned last week, it just was so dominant in our economy. We used it for incense, for religious purposes. We made rope out of it to tie our ships together, and we the earliest cloth. I didn't kind of get into it last week with my, when I had the hemp installation, but you can think very easily that the first mats were just like big pot plants woven together, put at the bottom of your cave or whatever, and it just, clothing evolved in a lot of ways from those, weavings that we use for floors, and we started to make clothes out of it, and hemp was the longest, strongest fiber that would last for years, so that's what you would use. And anyway, so cannabis is a tree of life, no doubt about it, and who knows why God prohibited the tree of life per se in the myth, because he doesn't say why, right? He doesn't even actually prohibit us from using the tree of life. He actually prohibits us from using the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Ironically, we're so banned from using the tree of life because we ate of this other tree, but I'll get into that in a second. My belief is that the tree of knowledge of good and evil is a representation actually of the magic mushroom. I believe long before we used cannabis for the sort of recreational or inspirational reasons we use it now, we discovered mushrooms. Like hundreds of thousands, millions of years ago, just like animals do now. They, go around, crawl, and eat, and test out all sorts of roots and plants, and at different times of the year, because we learned as very much animals that it was quite dependent upon when you did certain things, and otherwise we would have studied the natural environment long before we really learned to communicate in the way we do. But I also think that communicating resulted from our use of magic mushrooms as in small groups, that it wasn't just one person being inspired through the use of the mushroom that helped us communicate and come up with new concepts like gods and goddesses, but it was the female who discovered it in the myth, because women were very much the homebodies. So they would have been like really the alchemists of the old days. They would have been having all sorts of plants stored for the winter time, and would have known how to, use the natural environment in some ways much more than the men. The men would go out and scavenge all the time, and the women would sit there with the children and study everything that was happening around them. And so the women were the ones who really became quite aware of a lot of the plant life and mushrooms as well. And so anyway, the pagan mythologies of the day would have used not only mushrooms and cannabis, but every single little plant or substance they could have got their hands on. Many of us believe the ancient Egyptians, in fact, learned how to make some mild forms of LSD, and that when they were building the pyramids every day, they would have taken this small dose of ergot fungus that would have helped them kind of work and think as they put these intense structures together. And so the use of different drugs and sort of practices to inspire or I guess kind of help people become more aware, it goes back into ancient history. And all these different gods and goddesses love to take claim for anything that would have helped you have I guess both an enlightening experience or have any experience, right? So the most powerful gods and goddesses would be ones that could enter into you and somehow open up your mind or make you become more aware, or in the case of the magic mushrooms, right, it takes very little of them to have this very powerful experience. And it wouldn't have taken much for certain so-called shamans back in the day or healers to convince people that they had a very powerful god or goddess helping them by feeding them a little bit of mushroom tea, and they're just told, oh, here, have this drink, and God will enter thee through that, right, or the goddess, right? So, in the earlier days, initiates were very much convinced that their, god or goddess that they were following was powerful based upon how good their drugs were, and once, I didn't get into this too much, but say for example the ancient Hebrews, right? Like Moses made anointing oil that had 7 pounds of cannabis in it, right? They made a great big vat, and every initiate into the Hebrew priesthood, one of the stages would be a ceremony that they would have this vat of oil poured slowly over their head, and they'd have a great big white robe on and probably a turban as well, and a great big beard, right, and all this long hair. And essentially they try and soak them in this oil so that their entire bloodstream would become saturated with THC and these other cannabinoids. And this ceremony would be held at high noon, and they would have this platform, because all the different towns, they'd have squares, and at one end facing the sun, they'd have this platform, and then they'd have this hall behind it where the ceremonies would be held in private, right? So they'd be hotboxing this guy with incense. Because Napoli's temple balls, like you see these old altars that are this tall? There's one at the BC Museum. The most expensive piece of art at the BC Museum is a hash burning altar. They do not know what it is good for. If you go and ask them, they're like, oh, we don't know. But just think of great big balls of hash, because like back in the day, this is what they did. Burning slowly like charcoal, right? And it'd be mixed in with some other things to help it burn and smell very nice. But these things, Napoli's temple balls, they're called now, they would have just been piled up, and you would have had some of them burning, and you know how you can, get some hash burning and it'll just keep going. Well, as long as so they'd have like, these temples just filled full of hash burning on the altars, and they pour, the oil over the guy and spin him around, and he'd come standing out at high noon in front of the crowd, and he'd be introduced as the Son of God. And he would be bright, and he would be initiated in, like Apollo, for example, was one of the deities that was a sun god, right? And so becoming the Son of God was actually becoming an initiate in the worship of Apollo through the use of, these kind of anointing oils and stuff. And anyway, the Christian church really kind of mimicked a lot of these old pagan religions, but at the same time, they wanted to banish them. So, oh man, I could go on forever. Jesus. So anyway, Moses was the first real documented prohibitionist, okay? So on one hand, sure, he made the anointing oil and kind of documented showing that off, but Moses basically had escaped with apparently tens of thousands of people from Egypt, former slaves, and went back to what they thought was their homeland in what is now sort of modern day Israel and that area, just kind of living in the mountains. There wasn't much to eat, and there was very little water, and they didn't have anywhere to live. They were like pretty much like homeless, freaks just living in the middle of the desert, like 40,000 of them. And they weren't really an army, right? Like they were slaves before, and when they escaped from that, they were more like a bunch of clans, right? So you could think of them as, just numerous families who all agreed for whatever reason that it was in their best interest, to do this. And so, it wasn't exactly a tight unit, but Moses was, the one that so-called led the way. And so it was getting really crazy. They were running out of resources. They were having a number of their men and women, the young people that were going and worshiping some of the local deities. because their gods and goddesses, or God, Yahweh, I should say, wasn't really cutting it, and they were being starving and weren't having much fun in the desert. And they'd run across these other, kind of pagan religions of the day that, for example, most pagan religions would have a spring fertility weekend where essentially the entire village would just go and have sex with each other in the fields they wanted food to grow on as much as possible. And so it was something that, the fertility cults and their use of these different drugs and ceremonies were quite appealing. They were fun, and it was like, the more gods and goddesses, the merrier. It was thought, like, why not worship this next one? Because, hey, this is a goddess of rain. And back in the day, like, people would change gods and goddesses all the time and just add more to their repertoire, right? And the more gods and goddesses you knew and how to pay respect to them, like if there was a local goddess of the rain, well, hey, you'd want to do whatever she wanted so you get some rain, right? So that's what the locals do. We're in. So, but it caused a lot of problems.